Welcome everyone to the sixth Engage webinar, Future-Proofing Transatlantic Cooperation in an Age of Global Instability. My name is Gustavo Miller. I'm researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven in Belgium, which is a partner of the Engage Consortium. Engage is a Horizon 2020 project that looks into how the European Union can effectively and sustainably meet strategic challenges by utilizing all of its tools of external action and by consequence become a more assertive global actor. In a few weeks, the Engage project will publish a white paper on the European Union external action, compiling 3 years of insightful research and turning it into useful and actionable recommendations for the Union to recalibrate its role and place in the world. You can know more about Engage and its upcoming white paper by checking its website. That's engage-eu.eu and subscribe to its newsletter. Now to today's topic. Transatlantic relations stand at a pivotal crossroad. The result of the upcoming US elections can arguably reshape alliances, economic ties, and collaboration initiatives. In Europe, the European Parliament elections in a few months will, in all likelihood, result in increased representation of Eurosceptics and far-right groups. But there are also good news. The EU-US Trade and Technology Council emerges as a beacon of partnership, symbolizing a commitment not only to enhancing bilateral trade and technology cooperation, but also setting global standards for digital economy and tackling shared challenges such as cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. We also see parallel transatlantic efforts in the fight against climate change, as exemplified in the EU's Green Deal and on the American side, the US's Inflation Reduction Act, which underscore a united vision towards a sustainable future. And we can say there's also a common front in support for Ukraine in the war against Russia, even if financial support mechanisms and technical cooperation often lag a little bit behind expectations. So, with this scenario, how is it possible to make such a very much needed partnership more resilient to external and internal shocks? How is it possible to make it resilient to withstand changes in governments and diverging interests? To discuss these pressing questions, we have a stellar group of panelists with diverse perspectives. Frances Burwell is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. She's also senior advisor at McClarty Associates. Brian Glynn is Managing Director for the Americas at the European External Action Service. And Elena Lazaro is Acting Head of the External Policies Unity at the European Parliamentary Research Service. She's also an Associate Fellow at the US and the Americas Program at Chatham House. Thank you all three of you for being here with us today. I suggest we start with Brian, followed by Francis, and then finally with Elena as well for, let's say, a view from the European Parliament think tank, but also as a Chatham House associate. Each of our panelists will give us an initial talk of around 8 minutes, which will then be followed by Q&A. You, the audience, can reach us by asking questions via the Q&A button, usually found at the bottom of your screen. Now, first come, first served. We usually get a lot of questions, so make sure to ask your question as soon as you have it. Without further ado, Brian, for your initial intervention, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. A great pleasure to be with you all this evening. I've been asked to appear on quite a lot of these recently, and the question that everybody wants to know is who's going to win the US election and what should the EU do about it? You'd be glad to know I'm not going to tell you who's going to win the US elections, but I can tell you a little bit about what the EU is doing and hopefully what the EU will continue to do in this very important year, where, as you've mentioned, we of course have our own elections and our own political changes to navigate here in Brussels. The good news is that the transatlantic relationship is in good shape. It probably hasn't been in as good a shape for quite a long time. Transatlantic unity when it comes to our response to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine has been one of the key elements that has sustained Ukraine in its battle for its life against Russia. And we're stepping up and meeting challenges, not just in this area, but in every other area where we're working together. And the clear message is that we are bringing about change when we work together. You know the statistics about where we're at the moment in our support to Ukraine. We've already delivered 88 billion euro in support to Ukraine, with the additional 50 billion euro already agreed, and another 5 billion of Ukraine Assistance Fund adopted recently. Individual member states also providing 20 billion euro. All of that, of course, will not mean very much unless we can unlock the funding that we're waiting for coming from the United States. I was in the United States the week before last with the High Representative. All indications are that now that they have unlocked the latest saga in their budget debate, that there is a prospect, at least, that after the Easter recess, the funds for Ukraine could be unlocked. Um, I don't want to go into too much detail about what exactly we've been doing on our support to Ukraine, because I think you know that very well. You know also that this is a very crucial year. So that combination of not just the support that we have provided financially, but the very strong message that we've sent by opening accession negotiations with Ukraine, it indicates the clear direction of travel there. And just pausing there for a moment, on that question of opening accession negotiations with Ukraine, some of the concern on the part of some parts of the US political establishment is that the United States will be footing the bill for Ukraine for many, many years to come. The fact that we have decided to open accession negotiations means that when we come to our next budgetary cycle, we will incorporate the support that Ukraine needs to continue its path towards membership of the European Union from day one. That will involve a significant package of support, but it will be there from the very first day. All of the messages coming out of Russia are negative messages. Those messages, including the recent death of Alexei Navalny and the presidential elections, reaffirm the threat that Russia, led by President Putin, poses to the European Union, and emphasizes the need for that transatlantic unity. Beyond the battlefield, the EU and the US have been cooperating in areas that we haven't had structured cooperation before. With this administration, we have, of course, begun dialogues with the US on China, on Russia, consultations on the Indo-Pacific, and on security and defense as well. The Middle East is, of course, an area that has challenged the European Union because of differences of view amongst member states in particular. But I think as this conflict has gone on, you can see the positive influence of the European Union, and in particular of the High Representative, on the approach, the posture that's being taken by the United States. The fact that we now have a resolution in the Security Council that the United States acquiesced to suggests that we are moving towards the position of the other when it comes to supporting a ceasefire in Gaza. China is an issue that is one of the few issues that excites bipartisan interest in the United States. It's the one on which we have had the deepest dialogue in this administration. Interesting again that for the European Union, our de-risking strategy, as enunciated by President von der Leyen, is one that was enthusiastically taken up by the administration in the US. Another example of where we talk to each other, even if there appear to be divergences of view, we end up influencing each other when it comes to these key foreign policy challenges. The big question, I suppose, is what happens in November. There are two options: Trump 2, Biden 2. The fact that there's a 2 after each of these should give us a clue that we have experienced one version of each of these administrations. And if I could make an appeal to you, this is the historian in me. Foreign policy practitioners now have a tendency to look at problems as if we were journalists. And if you're a journalist, catastrophizing over what's going to happen is what gets attention and has people reading you. If you are a diplomat, on the other hand, you have to take a much longer perspective. Biden 2 and Trump 2 mean that there won't be a Biden 3 or a Trump 3 unless there's a rather dramatic change to the US Constitution, and I don't think that's going to happen. So even if we are consumed by dealing with the consequences of what happens in November, already we know that this is the end of an era. It's the end of an era of two potential presidents who have a huge interest in the European Union. One very positive, the other perhaps slightly less positive, shall we say. Whoever is the leader of the United States after these two presidents will be somebody who probably doesn't have that same instinctive connection with the European Union that President Biden certainly has and that President Trump is exercised about. So trying to make sure that in this next period, we are ready in the way that we were in 2020 when the new Biden administration came along with an offer to the new US administration. And that offer is essentially one that says, we have a transatlantic partnership that has stood the test of time. There are challenges in the world, particularly when it comes to alternative systems of governance that do not like when the European Union and the United States are united with each other, and will be trying to ensure that there is division between us. Our job will be to try to demonstrate all of the benefits there are to transatlantic unity, and equally to demonstrate that in areas of controversy, including our support for Ukraine as it battles for its survival against Russia, that this is also a battle that is about the interests of the United States. I think we have very successfully done that across the aisle in Washington. There is a large group in the Republican Party that gets it, that understands that a Russian victory in this conflict would be a victory not just for Russia, but for other actors that do not have the interests of the United States at heart. And the question that always arises when there's a change of administration in the United States is, how committed are they to the transatlantic security agenda? And without going into the details of what might happen, I would remind you that all political campaigns involve campaigning in poetry and governing in prose. Not everybody does what it is they promise to do on the campaign trail. And there will be plenty of other issues, other problems that will occupy a new administration. The High Representative has an interesting blog on this, the subject of future European defense and how we should react, not just to what's happening in the United States, but what's happening in the world in general. I recommend you read it. It's a short read. He essentially says that after the COVID-19 pandemic, we in the European Union lived through a Hamiltonian moment, because it was the moment when we decided that we would issue a common debt at a European level to alleviate the economic consequences of this significant event. He's now arguing that we may be entering what he calls a Demosthenes moment, where essentially the problems of the world are such that it will accelerate the understanding on the European side that we need to organize ourselves better when it comes to preparing for our own defense. This does not mean in any way that we are running away from NATO. It's all about strengthening the European pillar of NATO. We are beyond due the time when the European Union and NATO renew their vows. But essentially, if we imagine a world in which the direction of travel of the United States continues to be to see the world shifting towards the Asia-Pacific region, with the European Union still as an important ally, we have to accept the consequences of that and accept that this will involve the European Union taking more seriously its role in conjunction with NATO in providing for our own security. Reminder as well at this stage that, of course, those countries that are members of NATO and also members of the European Union are now making up the vast majority, with Sweden and Finland joining NATO. You can tell by my accent that I come from a country, one of the few countries that is not in NATO and also in the European Union. I can tell you that a lively debate is taking place in my country as well about security policy. It's probably not going to lead anytime soon to us abandoning our traditional policy of military neutrality, but it is nonetheless a debate that is happening that wasn't happening before. So maybe just to conclude at this stage, I thought I wasn't going to speak for very long, and now I ended up speaking for longer than I thought. It is a pivotal year, and by the time we get to the end of the year and the start of next year, we in the European Union have to be ready with an offer to a new US administration. Reminder that a Biden II administration is also a new administration. It may represent more continuity than a Trump 2 administration, but we have to be ready with our offer. And part of that offer will be about the European Union accepting that in the direction of travel, if you take the medium term as your guide, we'll be taking more responsibility for our own security. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. For those who are not very good with accents, you can definitely ask that question in the Q&A as well to find out more about this neutral country where Brian comes from. Now, you say, Brian, that transatlantic relations that have not been as good as they are now, but at the same time, it seems that they're sort of peaking because, as you say, the next US presidents, in plural, will probably not be as interested or linked to Europe as the current one is. That's very interesting thought there. Now, I would like to move back now across the Atlantic, really to Francis Burway, for a view from the United States on these issues of transatlantic relations. Francis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for including me in this discussion. Like Brian, I am not going to try and predict the US election. I think you should not pay attention really to anyone who lives and works in Washington because we really don't understand the way the rest of the country works politically. I would make a couple of points on that, though. One, it's very early in the game, and a lot of Americans are not paying attention yet to the election, despite the news reports. Secondly, this particular election, we are in unprecedented territory in terms of the legal challenges that one of the candidates faces. And I think anyone who tells you that they really understand what could happen and what the impact is, both legally and politically, just is talking about something that they don't really know. And so I think we really are in an unprecedented electoral season, and we'll just have to see how it works out. And on top of all that, we have, since the last presidential election, a whole new geopolitical landscape that I think will play into this in ways that we don't quite understand. I think, I've been on a number of panels over the past few months about future-proofing the transatlantic relationship. And I think I disagree a bit with the premise. I'm not at all sure that one should try to future-proof the relationship. After all, at the start of the Biden administration, I think very few people expected to find us basically supporting Ukraine in a war for its existence. If you future-proof something, it can be too static to respond to whatever it needs to respond to. And I think that is responding to what is happening is what keeps institutions and dialogues fresh and relevant. There has also been a lot of talk about institutionalizing the TTC, the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which I think, I'm a big fan of the TTC, and I think it's been a very innovative mechanism for bringing the two together in very constructive ways. But the reality is that if you have a president who not only has great hesitations about the US commitment to Europe, but actually does not think that the European Union should exist, that is going to be a very, very real challenge. Even if the higher up that you mandate that such a institution should be run, the more vulnerable it becomes to political shifts. So Biden 2, I think we will see a TTC. I would call it TTC 2.0 because I think it will differ from what we have now. And I think everyone has kind of agreed there's some polishing here and cutting here and enlarging here that needs to be done in the dialogue. If we have a Trump 2, I think what we have to do is think about which parts of the dialogue we really want to preserve and push them into a technical level that is not politically visible, so to speak, in the White House. And I would note that during the last Trump administration, although there was quite a lot of tension in the US-EU relationship about data protection and the transfer of personal data following the court's decision on Privacy Shield, President Trump had some opportunities to make that even more challenging, and he did not take those opportunities. So I think that there is a level at which this can function. Some dialogues, like the US-EU-China dialogue and the cybersecurity dialogue, did persist. And I think that that's the kind of experience that we have to be looking at, and it can be a very, very valuable way of moving forward. But my recommendation for now, since we are 10 days, less than that, away from the TTC in Leuven, is to pick a few good projects that have consequences for both the political world and stakeholders. Those are not always the same thing. And use this next year. I don't expect to see a TTC until early 25. Use this next year to come up with something that will look like early wins for whoever is in power. And I'm going to shamelessly promote a blog that I have launching on the Atlantic Council website in the next couple of days, which looks at some of these being, for example, a mechanism for tracing and transparency on supply chains, a defense industry dialogue so that we don't get into a big argument about where the EU is sourcing its military supplies from, a further work on AI, also on export controls, and a really strategic approach to how the US and EU together work with third countries, especially those who are kind of sitting on the fence. But I think the reality is that the TTC now, in this very geopolitical age that we're in, which is not where the TTC was born. The TTC was born in a much calmer age in mid-2021. It needs to become central to addressing the challenges that we face, and therefore has to be thought of not so much as a technical mechanism, but as a strategic mechanism that has technical elements, if I can put it that way. I noticed in some of the questions that I was given before this that one thing that was desired was an American perspective on the challenges that we face. And I think you have to differentiate between the challenges we face together and the challenges that are between us. And I will just say a couple of words about both of these. I think that if I look at the challenges we face together, Ukraine, China, the Middle East, AI governance, climate change, what we've seen, interestingly, and Brian mentioned this, is a convergence. We start in different places. We tend to start like this. And then through repeated discussions at a relatively high level, we have been able to converge quite remarkably. I look at the experience of artificial intelligence particularly, and particularly not so much on the regulation of AI, but the ambitions of where we want to go. And in having human-centric, ethical AI, the types of things that we see in the AI Act, but also in our executive order. I think on China, there has been really a very strong convergence, even if we sometimes speak about it differently. And I think that comes from, as was mentioned before in the United States, this is an area that enjoys bipartisan support. In Europe, it's more controversial. There's many more economic linkages, and that's something that Europeans have to deal with. But I think a lot of people in Washington are going to be watching the outcome of the investigation on electric vehicles and see how Europe plans to deal with this kind of, let's say, overcapacity. I do worry that in the United States, our foreign policy is increasingly politicized in this election year. I worry that in China, when it comes to China, that we will see each party, the Dems and the Republicans, try to outdo each other in being antagonistic to China. And so there may be more ratcheting up of tensions than the administration would really like to see. On Ukraine, I'm unfortunately rather pessimistic, and I hope very much that I am wrong about the Republicans in the House being willing to pass a support package at this point. They're out for another 10 days or so, I think, on recess, and we will see when they come back. But it is a lesson in how a small minority can waylay a policy, because it was correctly stated before, the majority of the Republicans would support that. I think the biggest challenge, though, that we face is in approaching those third countries that are sitting on the fence as we move into this more geopolitical strategic era of democracies versus authoritarian regimes. And I think we, the US and Europe together, have not done a good job in making clear the benefits of our system to those countries. We have seen in the TTC a few examples of outreach, Kenya, Jamaica, mostly in terms of broadband reception, providing laptops. This is small change. We need to be thinking much more generously, much more strategically. I think looking at Global Gateway, looking at US investment programs, GPII, how do we put those together and reach out to the countries that matter to us in the world community? As for challenges between us, I think the biggest challenge is that we are both moving towards industrial policy very rapidly, and we haven't figured out, despite our rhetoric, how to do this together. We say the right thing, and I think that we have, for the moment, come up with a good solution vis-a-vis the US IRA and the various programs that Europe has. We've reached kind of a stasis point and an understanding. But we are going to continue in the United States, I think, to fund green transition companies, and that's a good thing. And I think Europe is going to continue to do that too. But I think we have to work out, how do we do these things together? What do we do about the carbon border adjustment mechanism? This is potentially, particularly if it expands beyond the sectors that it's in now, this is potentially a real problem for the transatlantic economy. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done. It's done out of a good ambition, if you will. But it is something that is problematic to a country that doesn't have a carbon price. So I think we need to ask what role the TTC or technical dialogues that might succeed it can play. It has done a good job in terms of smoothing the rough edges in our cooperation on semiconductors, and increasingly on the clean energy dialogue after the IRA. So are there other sectors where this would be important? My last big point is that our objective should never be in the transatlantic relationship that we have a total consensus. It is just not possible to achieve complete consensus between us. We are both democracies with different domestic pressures, different constituencies that we must speak to. And we both need to sometimes differentiate between when a politician says something for domestic political matters, audiences, and when they are actually speaking to the other, so to speak. We must figure out what is a tolerable level of conflict and tension between us. I think that this varies, and in the current geopolitical context, for example, if you take the Airbus-Boeing dispute, I'm not sure that anyone thinks it's that important to resolve that right away, right now, given everything else that's going on. The global arrangement on steel, the steel negotiations, aluminum and steel negotiations, the critical minerals accord, personally, I think they're less important for themselves. They're more important because they show we haven't figured out how to run industrial policies in a transatlantic way. This is the strongest economic partnership in the world. It continues to be that. If you've seen the recent Transatlantic Economy 2024 report, we have high expectations of each other, and occasionally we fail. And I think that's just reality. We need to have mechanisms like the TTC that give us the opportunity and force us to meet every now and then so that things don't fester. Sometimes a meeting like the TTC is largely an opportunity to vent. And after that's done, you can be more constructive. Let me end by saying something in response to the comment about future leaders will not care about Europe as much. My exhibition A against that would be Nikki Haley and her very impassioned pleas about Ukraine. For many, many years, as long as I've been covering Europe, I have been hearing warnings about the successor generation in American politics who will not care about Europe because they demographically don't come from the Anglo-Saxon world, et cetera, et cetera. And I just haven't seen it. As people move up the ladder of political leadership, they tend to understand who our friends are. And I've also seen most administrations come in and go through a learning curve. They come in, they have their own priorities, they're going to figure out who their partners are, they're not doing what the person before them did. By the end of their first term, most, not all, but most, have realized that when they have a problem with China, for example, and they have to go in and complain, who else is there? It's not just the American ambassador, it's often the European ambassadors who are complaining about the same thing. So it's a difference. It's not a focus on Europe for Europe's sake. It's that Europe is our partner in addressing these other challenges around the world. And if you look at it through that lens, I think you will continue to see the American leadership post-Biden and Trump looking at Europe after a learning curve, after a spell of learning, as an continuing important partnership.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frances. That was very insightful. And in particular, I would like to highlight the idea that in the challenges that the transatlantic partners face together, here, for example, artificial intelligence, but also the China issue, so to speak, there's quite a lot of convergence, as you say. And but there's also room for improvement in the challenges of transatlantic relations, meaning here in particular, as you illustrate, industrial policy, that it has been indeed quite a contentious issue. We're going to move on to Elena now, who is facing connection issues, but we might be able to hear her if we do not see her. Elena, can you hear us?
Yes, I can intermittently. I hope you can hear me too. I'm very sorry about this. I've been struggling a bit. I think I got most of it though. First of all, thank you for having me here today. I mean, Brian and Frances have helped me a lot because they've already said everything. So I'll be short so you can hear me. And also I'll try to bring in some of the more niche and perhaps less traveled issues. So there's a couple that I had on my list, but most of what I had has been mentioned. First, let me say one thing with an umbrella statement before I get into the questions you asked, Gustavo. And let me also say I'm speaking here in my personal capacity as a researcher, but obviously in my service, we gather as much as we can all the expert views. So it's also a result of reflecting on that. One thing I think we should keep in mind from I think what the general consensus is, that the general direction of travel of US foreign policy will be, regardless of the next president, will face the same constraints and have similar contours in terms of, you know, the need to have competitiveness in technology and in global markets, the financial constraints, the debt, the increased spending on defense, the China question. So I think there are some issues that are sort of underpin the next administration, regardless which one it will be, that will play into how their global insertion and global politics will play out, including engagement with Europe but also multilateralism, which is important because a couple of things I'm going to say have to do as well with how the EU and US will engage in future multilateral issues that face tremendous challenges. So that's kind of, I think there are some issues that we can identify that I think will continue to be part of whatever considerations any administration has. But of course, the devil is in the detail, and the nuances will be different, and the policies will be different. And on China, for example, which has been mentioned a number of times, I think the Biden administration has definitely been, much more sort of measured and tried to have an approach of sort of, the American interest, but with some degree of dialogue that definitely wouldn't be reflected in what Trump proposes to do, both in terms of the tariffs, but also, suspending MFN status and other things. We would see a much more aggressive policy. That being said, your question was, I hope you can still hear me, because everyone's frozen, so I don't know what's happening, but I hope you can still hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay. That being said, to your questions, your first question was sort of what is the EU, what are Europeans thinking about when thinking of the second Trump administration? And this speaks to the point about the future proofing. There is indeed so much around. I think I get 2 or 3 pieces per day called planning for a Trump administration 2 or future proofing, etc. And on one hand, future proofing may not be the solution, but future thinking, future planning, I think all of this is part of the puzzle to be prepared for any eventuality. I think the general contours of what Europeans are thinking is, a Trump 2 would be unpredictable, transactional, some kind of isolationist that perhaps is not the same isolationism we have known in the past. It could be a Pacific-oriented isolationism or not. I think that's still up for discussion. But definitely that unpredictability tops the list. And then there are the 2 main issues of trade and defense. And then on the trade, I think a lot has been said, but it has to do definitely with sort of reversing the progress that's been made. And Brian and Francis spoke to it, not only the TTC, but on steel and aluminum tariffs, and would we go back to a previous condition? And also, of course, with China-US relationship. And I think one question underlying there is, would Europe or would the EU have to choose even more between China and the US? Because at the moment, there is a management of that relationship, but it is, I think, a feeling that Trump would really perhaps have to force a choice of either or. And then on defense, again, the questions have been laid out. I think perhaps 2 of the key questions are, of course, on the one hand, the continued support to Ukraine, and that we see is already facing problems, because I do want to say most of these issues are also issues of, congressional politics, and that's something I'll speak to when I come to my proposals of engagement. But I don't think the legislative branch should be underestimated here on a number of these issues, not least because of the budgetary dimension. But of course, there is the Ukraine issue, which links to NATO, of course, and the continued support for NATO, but also US commitment to NATO. And then there is also the issue of what would Trump mean for what has been set in motion in the EU in terms of European defense industrial policy, because of course there is the commitment to more spending, there are various degrees of that. We've just seen the Commission's new European defense industrial strategy and the accompanying regulation, some money there, but of course there is also much more in the making in terms of blend of capital market involvement, etc. But the question I think here is, would the next United States president be enable the EU defense spending, if that defense spending were to be spent on the European defense industrial base, or would it be Buy American in exchange for? And I think that would probably be something that would take a different form depending on whether it was Trump or Biden. So I think defense and trade, of course, at the center of the thinking. But I want to also mention issues that I think are underlying, other areas of policy in which the EU is involved and could be significantly affected. And these are all the areas that relate to multilateralism, and I think particularly to global public financing and global public goods. There is a huge discussion going on at the moment about the role of multilateral development banks, and this again links to relations with the so-called global South and Africa in particular. And I think I think whether the next United States president is supportive of these efforts to increase, global debt relief, global international financial institutions in supporting developing states, not least climate financing, which is a huge issue for those states. And I think this in itself would be an issue that would perhaps face huge challenges from a Trump administration, particularly if the stance on climate is the same as we saw in the previous one. But also then, as we see a proliferation of international humanitarian law issues, and which involve international courts. Again, we know the U.S. stance on this, but with Trump, it could be completely, there could be disengagement and even more estrangement between the EU and U.S. positions, and then, of course, the WTO on this multilateral theme. And then again, finally, the issue of engagement with like-minded partners, and this has been spoken to a lot by Francis and by Brian. At the moment, it would seem to me there is a very good momentum in the EU and the US, including to a degree through NATO, for example, and Japan engaging with partners, and especially in the Indo-Pacific, but that would and could be challenged. So I think this is the general discussion that there is out there about, what are the challenges that a second Trump administration could bring. There is also, when looking at certain points of view coming from certain capitals, an apprehension about whether Trump would engage in a sort of divide and conquer, for lack of a better expression, way of engaging with the EU, whether, again, we would see him displaying preferential relations with certain leaders in the EU, and what kind of impact that would have on the EU itself. So this is also, I think, part of the narrative that we're seeing out there. However, getting to your second question, which is what is the way to engage and how to avoid the gaps and the friction, or potential complete estrangement this could bring. I think a few points that have been mentioned, and then a couple that haven't, on the Trade and Technology Council. It's interesting because at this point it does have its own institutional inertia. It has been around for a while, and one thing to say is that a lot of what the Trade and Tech Council has addressed are issues that also relate to legislation, and the AI Act has been mentioned, but there are other items: export controls, legislation on critical raw materials. So I think, as Francis said, if one identifies certain areas, specific areas, it is not just about engagement executive to executive, but it's also about whether there is already the momentum in place for the kind of legislation that implements what issues on which there seems to be alignment in the TTC on both sides. So there I get again to the congressional and parliamentary branch, that a lot of what is in the TTC, even export controls in the US, a lot of it is admittedly executive orders, but in the EU, a lot of it is actually legislation. So I think there is a lot there that has already assumed a certain amount of inertia, and that is in the making already. And the idea of a defense industry dialogue is a really good one. I really like it. The local level, I think, or rather the state level, is important. A number of scholars that have spoken to us at EPRS have noted that in a lot of states in the US, what the EU is doing on any issue is not a known. It's that there needs to be more public communication on this, and I know that a lot is being done already. But I think, when looking for strategies of engagement, it's important to always remember that the US is a federal state. It's state by state. You can have very different ways of outreach, including to the business communities. And I know the EAS is doing a lot of that, and it's always a future-proofing method that has potential. And again, I also think in innovation and technology, the private sector is a channel of engagement beyond just engaging on the executive level, and that's also concentrated in certain states. But I want to stay on the issue of the legislative branch, because apart from the TTC, I think we've had a lot of signals from U.S. Congress, even in its current makeup, that there is, I would say, bipartisan support, albeit not from every part of each party, for a very transatlanticist approach. I mean, everyone mentions usually the Tim Kaine, Marco Rubio, NATO proposal, NATO legislation in that context, which, the congressional oversight over the president in terms of withdrawing from NATO. I think in the Munich Security Conference, where, if I'm not mistaken, there were over 40 members of Congress represented, there was, by and large, signaling of support for transatlanticism. So I think there is a resilience there in interparliamentary relations that could be leveraged even more. So to me, that is also one medium of engagement that should not be forgotten. And then finally, on the relevance of engaging collaboratively with other partners, I agree that there's been a lot of alignment with Biden on who to engage with, the EU, US, and then with regard to third countries. But I think both the US and the EU recognize that we should be doing more in terms of understanding the global South, the so-called global South. And I think that would not change regardless of perhaps not at the presidential level, but in terms of the executive level, the policies implemented, there needs to be some format of engagement with the global South and the TTC with third countries. And the TTC part that does work on that could indeed, I agree with Francis, turn into some mechanism or other working group that could look into the joint interests in that, regardless of who is in charge, because at the end of the day, it would also be transactional. I think the TTC label in itself has been very connected to the Biden administration, so probably wouldn't be called it that way under a different president. But these elements of it that could remain, indeed, some of them are not so much normative, but rather transactional. So I don't see that as being a huge challenge to an administration that would want to be transactional, because at the end of the day, it does embed themes that do speak directly to US interests, and those parts would, I think, be retained. And I'll stop here also because I have really no clue if I can be heard, because I am staring at the immobile screen, but I hope you could hear me to some degree.
Thank you so much, Elena. We could hear you loud and clear. Thank you to all three of you for a very insightful.
And I cannot hear you now if you're speaking.
We can hear you. That's all fine. Now we have a few questions coming in from the audience. The first one has to do with basically the future of the European pillar within NATO. I assume this question is mostly for Brian, but the others can also feel free to tackle it. What will be the future of CSTP if we are indeed to consolidate the European pillar of NATO? While more questions are coming in, I also have some tailored questions for each one of you. For Brian, both Francis and Elena, they mentioned that the EU could do, and the EU and the US both could do a better job when approaching third countries. And sort of bringing them to their side in this changing global order. Now, part of your role, Brian, it's not only the United States, but also pretty much the whole of the Americas. So I wonder what's the coordination at these days when it comes to joint approach from the US, from the European Union for interacting with Latin America. On that end, I'll be curious to hear about that. For Francis, you mentioned, of course, that there's a lot of convergence, in particular when it comes to artificial intelligence, but also the position vis-a-vis China. But you also briefly mentioned climate change, right? So I wonder if you think that that's a potential zone of divergence in the future. And I wonder if you could also even if that's a little bit of the spoiler regarding your upcoming blog post, if you could talk more about the idea of defense industry dialogue. I forgot the precise name here, which has been indeed a contentious area, and that could probably foster some consensus. So I wonder if you could talk more about that. And for Elena, I don't know if you can hear us, but the question would go in the direction of the impact of domestic European issues or events on the transatlantic relation, because we talked a lot about, well, the potential impact of the American elections, even though none of the panelists would like to predict the results, but we talked about that. So what about the potential impact of the European Parliament elections, right? And also in terms of domestic issues here, we know, and many of you already mentioned, that some European countries are more vulnerable to the influence of Russia and China. How does that play a role in transatlantic relations from, let's say, what happens within the institutions and the consensus building and so on? So those are the questions. There is another one that just came in as well. We might as well tackle this. We don't have time for a second round. So this is from Luke Haley. Do you feel the divide can be healed in the defense industrial cooperation between the US and the EU, specifically after the naval group AUKUS debacle that she references? Of course, AUKUS being a cooperation between the US, the UK, and Australia, so of course not including the EU in there. So I'll throw these questions back at all of you, and I'm sorry that we only have time for this initial round. Perhaps you'd like to start, Brian.
Okay, then maybe I can tidy up as well some of my own responses, if you don't mind, to what the other two speakers have said. Thoroughly enjoyed this, as I think we all managed to complement each other without being complimentary. What Francis said about a third, what happens after Biden and Trump, I'm comforted by what she says. My point, I think, was that the intensity of this relationship now, it's difficult to imagine it being repeated. I'd recall the Obama presidencies as being considered on the European Union side. Many people consider them to be serious lost opportunities, given the general warmth of the relationship at the time. The priorities were elsewhere, and that's fine. And I think that I can see a future where that perhaps is that the good intentions are there, but the priorities might lay elsewhere. I take your point that in the spiky world we live in, needing to know who your friends are and engaging with them more may trump that as well, if you'll pardon the use of that verb. When it comes to cooperation between the EU and the US in Latin America, the area that I know best, I think this is another example of something that we don't talk about very much, but this period of transatlantic cooperation has also seen, I think for the first time, a somewhat structured cooperation between the EU and the US on Latin America. The EU has done a lot to rebuild its relationship with Latin America. The United States doesn't have the luxury of having a policy towards Latin America. It has many policies towards its region, including a migration policy. So it's more difficult to see something that is essentially domestic policy in many ways. We see it more as a foreign policy issue. But I myself have now a regular dialogue with my colleague from the State Department, Brian Nichols, in a way that wouldn't have happened before. Equally, when it comes to sticky issues like Venezuela, we do speak to the United States on a very regular basis, both the State Department and the NSC. And when it comes to that very important question about what is the offer of the democratic world, how are we different from the Chinas of the world? We're not doing enough in this area, but we are talking to each other more and trying to make sure that our national, our respective offers, be it Global Gateway, PGII, that they're being coordinated in the G7, and that we have a narrative that goes with it. And I think that that's an exercise that you'll see more of, hopefully, in the next period as well. On the questions on the future of the security transatlantic relationship, I go back to what Frances said at the start of her intervention. At the start of this administration, nobody imagined that we would be engaged in supporting Ukraine in the way we were. So what we are doing in Europe at the moment is one of those periods that when we look back, we will say, how did we manage to do this as quickly as we did? That speed has been necessary in order to make sure that we make the best of the instruments that we have to support Ukraine at its time of need. But we are coming up against some of the inbuilt inefficiencies, if you like, because we are, as European Union, acting in a certain way. The vast majority of the member states of the European Union are also in NATO. Making those two giant oil tankers move at the same time is not very easy. And the question that's asked about defensive industrial cooperation, there's always going to be competition in this area. It's inherent, it's built in to the way that these products are designed and are offered on the market as well. The AUKUS issue was one where I think was an example of some of the early stumbles in the relationship on this area. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was another example. And this administration, the US administration, did take stock very quickly of what this meant for the transatlantic relationship and took steps to make sure that things like that didn't happen again. But the defense industry cooperation, the defense industry dialogue is as essential as the official level security and defense dialogue is, and the political level security and defense dialogue, because frankly, we speak different languages. There is a standard NATO language about what defense cooperation looks like, and incorporating into that the European Union as a more developed security and defense actor will take time. And it is, again, an example of something that we started with this administration. The last one we did looked very different from the first one. The first one sounded a little bit like two people speaking a different language. The interpreters have got better as we've moved in through the third and fourth iteration of it. Let's hope that we can continue to do that. I'll stop here because the others need to speak. Just to say that the non-NATO countries, I'm from Ireland, there is a debate going on. The evolution of European security and defense policy as it's happening is currently happening on the basis that those countries that have policies of military neutrality are not stopping the others from going ahead. And that certainly looks like the direction of travel for now. Where this will end, we do not know, but there's a provision for it in the treaties. So we're in an area which can lead to something that is somewhat different from where we are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. Francis, on to you with quite a lot of questions, really.
I'm just going to make a few comments because I know we are just about at the witching hour. On climate change under two different administrations, I think repealing legislation like the IRA is incredibly difficult. Look at the Republican efforts to repeal Obamacare, for example. They've tried to do it like more than 50 times and have failed. This is a project, the IRA is something that is creating financial incentives not only for companies, but for individual homeowners who are replacing their windows and doors and adding solar to their roofs and things like that. So I think that if Mr. Trump is returned to office, who has been vociferous in his support of the fossil fuel industry, I think that we will see a lot of rhetoric, but we won't see a repeal of legislation. What we will see is an environmental protection agency which is very much challenged and is probably shorn of a lot of staff and has its mandate reduced. So some of the things that it has expanded into doing during the Biden administration, it may not be able to do as much anymore. We will also not see things like what are called environmental justice programs, thinking about pollutants and chemicals in municipal water systems, especially in poorer areas. So that will be the shift. I think it's a shift that is much more regulatory rather than legislation. The biggest thing is, of course, that on the multilateral front, the United States will go from being a big player again to being a non-player, because that's where it really matters in terms of the president's intentions. On the defense industry dialogue, I would just point out that the new strategy on its fact sheet, so the lead stuff that it says, talks about 50% of member states' defense procurement budgets being spent in Europe. So this is something that I think could open up the door to a lot of misunderstandings or tensions with the United States, because rightly or wrongly, you spend a lot of money on defense with American companies in the United States. And that makes sense because we have a pretty thriving defense industry. I think as Europe rationalizes its defense industry and consolidates its defense industry, there will be pressures to spend in Europe, and I think that's understandable. But it requires a conversation, and I think it's actually time for both of us to have this conversation about whether, as allies, we are comfortable buying essential equipment from each other and depending on each other for continued supplies of that equipment. That's why I'm thinking about this dialogue, which could, for example, help define what is a European or an American company. Is it a company that is headquartered there or one that has significant assets, including lots of jobs in a particular location? And I think those are all things that as we think about, not only Ukraine, but the possibility of action to defend Taiwan and other areas. Look at what's going on in Africa now with the Russians and the Wagner Group, etc. Are there things that we need to be prepared for, and at what point does it become less national and more regional, a defense club, if you will? Finally, let me just say that I think for almost any US administration, Europe does better when it shows up in Washington and says, this is what we are doing, these are in our interests, and we want to talk with you before everything is signed, sealed, and delivered to see how we can do this in a good way together. What does not work so much is when Europe shows up and says, what can we do to be your friend? And it's a subtle difference, but I think Europe is becoming a global actor itself. There are times when I think everyone who follows Europe wants Europe to do more. The last few years have been revolutionary in terms of European foreign policy and activities. There's no doubt about that. And so I think the important thing is with any US administration to come in with the ideas, the focus, the initiatives. And I think in the last couple of years, we've seen that. And even if the US administration is less welcoming, I think that has to continue.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Francis. Now I'm not sure if Elena can hear us. Elena, are you still there for the last question, the impact of the European Parliament elections in transatlantic relations?
Well, I can hear you, although I'd rather skip that question, to be honest, because I think it will be up to the parliamentarians to themselves to decide. But maybe to say, I think the institution that is the European Parliament across time has been one that has always in its resolutions been in favor of the trans relationship, has supported it, has called for a stronger one, both in trade and technology and security, especially in light of the war in Ukraine. I think that's clear, and I think absolutely in line with the executive in the EU, which has been committed to the transatlantic relationship, and at the same time, not in any way finding this contradictory to the EU's development of its own, what we used to call strategic autonomy, which is now a bit passé, but a degree of let's say building on its policies in a number of areas, including security and defense. But I do want to say, and now move to the defense issue here, if I may, that this current war is also one that opens up the discussion on nuclear deterrence, merely, if only merely because the aggressor is one of the two biggest nuclear powers in the world. And on this, I think the transatlantic relationship is admittedly across the board indispensable. So we should not forget this. On the European pillar of NATO, if I may just add a word, I think we are on a course where, regardless whether we call it such or not, it's getting stronger just by the fact that we have 2 more EU member states joining NATO. And because, according to all data that we see, this year it will be, if I'm not mistaken, 7 EU member states that surpass the 2% GDP spending for defense. So that means in itself that contribution to NATO by the EU member states will be larger. And then again, what everyone means by the EU pillar in NATO is different, but what I think the presence of the EU in NATO is robust, and it will be more. And in fact, what is interesting to me is that discussions that I hear from, in NATO and reflections being made in NATO acknowledge that beyond the GDP, beyond the spending, there are issues on which NATO is now involved and concerned about, including supply chains, including technological innovation, including the southern flank, all of which, I think there is a big acknowledgement that if only for its regulatory power, the EU has the capacity to act very much in support of NATO goals, including in light of a US policy that is focused more on China and the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's not about the name, but I do think that the way the EU is charting its course, which gives it, which in economic security issues and technology security issues and disinformation and cyber security, which have all become NATO issues as well, not to mention terrorism, it has the legal capacity and the financial capacity to act and the infrastructure to protect. So I think that in itself, whether we call it that or not, is making the EU an actor in NATO, and I think there is acknowledgement in NATO that the common agenda is expanding. So it's I think that's a discussion that is being had, and I think when we call it European pillar of NATO, everyone gets, oh, what is that? But when we look at what actually is happening, there is a coincidence of goals, and there is capacity to act in a different way from the 2 institutions that are very complementary, and on the issues of US EU proper, and here Brian is probably the one who knows better than me, but I think that the security dialogue is a facilitating mechanism, and with regard to US participation in EU defense industrial initiatives, I mean, the wording in the regulations is very, very specific about what it means, and the entities that are participating, where their interests lie, the sharing of intellectual property. But I do hope that the mechanisms in place serve as facilitating spaces. The dialogue, the administrative arrangement with the EDA, and the Trade and Tech Council to the degree that it continues. So I'll leave it at that. Sorry, I didn't talk about the elections very much, but that's really for the politicians.
No, thank you, Elena. I understood from this panel that we are going beyond the elections here and really going, because the elections at the end of the day are just the surface of this partnership. Thank you also to all the 3 panelists. I'm afraid we are running out of time. We try to keep these webinars short and sharp, this section will be available at the Engage website. You can already find their recorded versions of on topics such as sanctions, the EU strategic compass, energy security, and more recently also trade in the geoeconomic term. This webinar was co-organized with the Europe American Fund of K11, which, by the way, as Francis said, will receive the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council in 2 weeks' time. Our next Engage webinar is in 3 weeks' time. It will delve into the EU's policies towards the Indo-Pacific region. You can already register for that webinar in the Engage website. Until then, goodbye, and thank you to the panelists.